Hi, my name is Brian Moore of EMR NAM News. And what I'd like to do is talk about GSCOP from the point of view of the retailer. And this is aimed at helping you see what they may be preparing in terms of applying the process in their trading relationships. They will also put on the table a contract supply agreement that is drawn up obviously from their perspective, and the key is that you would be unwise to simply sit still and await developments. What we need to do is talk about some of the real opportunities within GSCOP for both parties on the basis, if you like, of fair share relationship. In fact, GSCOP represents major opportunities for both parties. In the first place, it represents a potential breakthrough in supplier-retailer relationships unprecedented in the UK. It also gives an opportunity to reassess both internally and externally all aspects of the supplier-retailer partnership. It provides a basis for fair share dealings that are legally enforceable. However, you need to bear in mind that GSCOP protects the consumer and has been designed to do so, and not suppliers. And that this new code will need driving by suppliers, in that the government won't be driving it, and equally retailers will have less interest in doing so. Now, when it comes to the GSCOP band conditions, it's obviously crucial that both parties calculate the cost and value of every band condition from each side's point of view in order to be able to negotiate change. Now, first of all, a retailer can no longer demand extra credit. They've got to negotiate it, obviously, and bearing in mind that they currently pay their bills on average in about 45 days, there's potential scope there for extending that period by negotiation, and in the past a demand for 90 days credit was not out of the question in some cases. There's no longer a requirement for a supplier to predominantly fund a promotion. In other words, if you're on fully funding at the moment, then think 50% funding, and you begin to appreciate the losses a retailer will make and will want to recover. There's no longer any obligation to contribute to marketing costs, by which I mean obviously store openings, staff incentives, etc. And again, whatever you're paying at the moment, think of that in terms of being reduced to zero and the retailer or customer needing to recover that in other ways. You're not obliged as a supplier to make any payment for shrinkage, and bear in mind that that represents on average across the board 2% of retail sales. You'll get some appreciation of what a retailer needs to recover. There are also no payments for wastage, and distinguish shrinkage from wastage in that shrinkage is obviously stolen product, whereas wastage is product going out of code. And wastage can represent around 5% of sales for a retailer. So again, think of that being reduced to zero and the need to recover it. It's no longer necessary, or it cannot be obliged to make any payments as a condition of being a supplier, by which I mean listing fees, for instance. And again, think the amount you're actually paying currently in listing fees, that being reduced to zero, and you'll have some idea of what the retailer will need to, if you like, recover from the allowable conditions. There's also a new element to do with compensation for forecasting errors, and that means effectively that a retailer either carelessly or, if you like, consciously over forecasting for promotional quantities with a view to selling at normal prices after the promotion and making extra margin. Any surplus of that kind has to be repaid to the supplier. And finally, there's one other element then to do with the fact that no longer can a supplier be arbitrarily delisted by the retailer without a good, if you like, rationale. And again, this means a lot of case building by the actual retailer in order to substantiate that delisting. Now, obviously, most retailers will want to recover these losses, and they'll do so by extending credit by negotiate agreement, as I've just touched on. They'll also explore the possibility of extending the amount you pay in terms of trade funding, and bearing in mind that's currently up to 20% of purchases. There has to be scope in a retailer's mind for moving this further. But I think the big area will be deductions, like deductions off invoices, for instance, where it's currently said to be around 3 to 10% of invoice sales, and there's got to be scope for extension of the deductions, if you like, process. Keep in mind at all times that retailers cannot, because of city pressure, and will not absorb losses from banned conditions. So we can see now that retailers operating, many of them, on knife-edge profit margins are in no position to, if you like, absorb losses from banned conditions. They will have calculated these losses and will have already begun to look for ways of recovering the losses from the available or allowed conditions, and also some new conditions they'll try to build into the contract. They will have drawn up a supply agreement that is drawn in their favour, and we need to be able to present an equivalent one drawn from your side and negotiate with the result. So we'll talk about some of those ideas now. What this all means for both parties is, first of all, they need to quantify all of the losses and potential losses arising from the introduction of GSCOP. It's necessary to explore the scope of allowable conditions, particularly from a retailer's point of view, as a means of recovering losses on the banned conditions. Again, this may not be enough in terms of the amount needed to be recovered, so they will be looking for sources of additional recovery. And something no one is mentioning except some of the retailers is the cost of GSCOP administration. At least they will try to, if you like, transfer some of this cost back up the supply chain to the supplier base. We need to, obviously, each party map the extent of give and take required to make this all work, and especially the cost and value of every concession. And again, there has to be a willingness for both parties to, if you like, negotiate and have the ability to negotiate a fair share supply agreement. Now, in terms of how suppliers will respond to GSCOP, obviously this depends a lot on the supplier's own risk profile in terms of whether they are risk averse, risk neutral or risk seeking. There's also the issue of the extent to which they're willing to walk away, bearing in mind that, as I say, given the size of some of these customers, walking away could result in a factory closing, so we're talking about a fundamental step here. There's also the issue of the supplier's willingness to litigate in the case where they feel that a supply contract has been breached. And again, that will take courage, particularly in terms of the scale of loss if it goes wrong. You have to be able to go in and win these cases. And a lot will depend on the ability of the supplier and their willingness to develop their own contract and not simply take a retailer-driven contract as standard. So in terms of action and key takeaways, what you need to do is download a copy of the GSCOP document, circulate it and get as much feedback as possible. You need to involve your lawyers locally, in continental Europe and globally, in order to present a uniform legal approach to the customers, particularly the global players. You need to quantify each aspect of the banned conditions in terms of cost and value from each party's point of view, and do the same with the allowed conditions. You need to, as I say, define limits and walkaway points for your company and stick with them. You need to develop your own contract in order to be able to negotiate some compromise between your version and their version of the supply agreement. You need to anticipate but do not initiate the complaints procedure, and in the same way you need to be prepared to go into court to win, but if possible avoid going legal. So what you're in fact doing is preparing to fight your corner for fair share agreements between yourselves and the retailers based on the new GSCOP, as I say, procedure. Thank you very much indeed.